So welcome everybody to our Learning Experience by Design webinar, or how to design a learning experience. My name is Emma Bridger. I'm the founder of People Lab. We are an employee experience and engagement consultancy. So we work with organisations to help them create amazing experiences, including learning experiences that result in engagement. That's probably all you need to know about me. And I am joined by my esteemed colleagues. We've got Katie in the background who'll give you a wave, who's here to look after the technical side of things. And we've got my esteemed colleague, Justin McCarran. Justin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I am the esteemed colleague, Justin McCarran. Thank you very much, Emma, for such a warm welcome. And hello and welcome to you all. I'm delighted to be joining you today and looking forward to the discussion. I'm here in my guise today talking about the work that I've been doing with Edison Red over the past year, and also with Emma and People Lab in terms of taking advantage of what happened to the world of training, rather than feeling like it was the end of the world, actually thinking, well, if it is the end of the world, how do we reinvent a new world? So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts and experiences as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Justin. Any comments as we're going through, feel free to use the chat. Always good to get some conversation going. Any questions? We've got a formal Q&A session at the end, of course. It wouldn't be a webinar without that. But ask us questions as we go through as well. If you want to put them in the chat or unmute yourself, then that's great. So in terms of what we are going to cover today, I mean, hopefully it's all pretty clear from the comms we sent out. But we wanted to explore, as Justin said, this opportunity for a new and different approach to learning, which is really exciting. I'm going to go into that a little bit more around the opportunity that going through this global pandemic, although it's been awful in many ways, there have been some really great opportunities to do things differently. We're going to talk about this term learning experience design and say, well, what do we mean by that, and how do we do it? And I'll be honest, this is something we are really experimenting with at the moment. So we'd love to hear your views on this. We've got a few simple tools to help you. Really like to make these sessions dead practical. So whilst it's great to share, evidence, practice, etc., it's always good to go away with some tools you can actually put to work. So I'm going to share some tools with you as well. I'm going to bring it to life, as Justin said. We've both been working with clients over the last year and previous, actually, on experimenting with a new way of approaching learning in organizations. So Justin's got some case studies, if you like, some experience he's going to share, as have I. And we couldn't have a webinar without talking about the elephant in the room, the role of tech. So we're going to cover a little bit of that as well. And we're also going to just touch on the critical role that culture and mindset play as well. Something that's really interesting to us in terms of the personal responsibility we have for our learning at work. So that's what we're going to cover. So to get us started, I'm going to hand over to Justin, who's going to kind of set the scene really as to why we need a different approach. So over to you, Justin.
Unmuting myself. Thank you, and congratulations for no one telling me I was muted. I did know. I was searching frantically for my unmute button. Yeah, thanks. That gives you, I think, a broad kind of broad understanding of what we're looking at today. But to sort of take a step back, we've been playing with a number of themes over the last few years, and I think what happened was the advent of the pandemic and the emptying of the diary. Any of you who've read my blog post that I shared with People Lab the other day will know about this. It afforded us to actually have time to really dig into those questions and to explore the hunches that we had been developing over the last few years. And I'm sure many of you will have been sharing the same hunches. We don't know, of course, exactly what your role is, but we can assume that because you're here, you have some interest in the topic. But in essence, there was a few things going on for us, but the primary thing was this sense that human beings, we have an innate need to grow and develop. We are left to our own devices. We experiment, we play, we try things out, we practice, we get better, we change, we adapt. We do all of that stuff, as countless experiments have shown. And of course, those of you who've read Dan Pink's book on motivation drive will know all about that. That's what happens when we're left to our own devices. So why is it that we've ended up inventing this whole system to do something which is actually innate and natural to us? So first of all, that's a sort of curious question. How have we ended up where, as Bonnie Chook says, we've taken our natural desire to learn and we've separated it out and created a separate department. So we have learning and development as if that's something separate from everything that we do. It seems kind of crazy. And then the other thing was this growing body of evidence that sadly for us as training providers, that learning quite often doesn't work. It doesn't really achieve the desired outcomes. There are various meta-analysis of training interventions and how effective they prove, particularly how effective they prove over time. And a lot of the research is focused on leadership training specifically, but there's some fairly, shocking statistics really. So just pull out a few for you from the Association of Training and Development. Even when training is liked by participants, which isn't always the way, only 37% of it led to new skills. Just 13% of it was relevant to the workplace, and only 3% had an impact on the company. I mean, so if I was finance, I'd be going, I've got a 3% return on this investment. And there's more. 80% of new skills are lost within a week of formal training if they're not used. All of these statistics were pointing to a fairly sorry picture. So we kind of took these two thoughts and we thought, well, on one hand, we know humans learn innately, naturally. And then on the other hand, we know how we're helping them to learn doesn't work. So what happens when you put those two things together? Well, of course, you realize that you have to invent a new way of learning, a new way of creating an environment for people where they will flourish naturally and their own curiosity will drive their learning. And so we started to unpick all of the things that don't quite work about the traditional training learning model, if you like. And of course, not everything doesn't work. Let's be clear about it. It does. Some of it does work, particularly the People Lab interventions, of course. There were marvelous feedback, sustainable change in the business, and high impact on the bottom line, of course. But it kind of, to put it in context, if you've watched the Ken Robinson talks about how we're getting education in schools wrong, the same kind of applies to a large extent to how we treat learning interventions for adults. We need to, as Emma said, we need to kind of change the narrative and actually flip it on its head and think, well, let's start with what works for humans and then build a system around that supports them to do that. Let's set things up and get out of their way and let humans go and learn and grow and experiment and develop by themselves. So that's kind of the background to where we've been digging, if you like, in our research. And as Emma said, we've started to put a lot of this directly into practice as a result of the pandemic, and building on the methodology as well, of course, in Emma and Belinda's book, Employee Experience by Design. It essentially, what we're talking about here is it involves creating learning experiences that are human-centered. So, that'll be familiar terminology for a lot of you. And we're drawing from positive psychology, design thinking, but really to create an experience. So it's a learning journey for people, and it's right for the employees and it's right for the organization. And also crucially, there's a degree of personalization for the learner so that they can choose how to interact with it, and ultimately that it has a positive effect on the company. That was a not so brief bit of context, Emma, but you know me, I don't do brief.
It's all good. It's all good. Thank you. Got a great comment as well from Martin. Thank you, Martin, saying interesting tidbit. There's other research to suggest that there's no connection between liking a piece of learning and it having impact. I mean, absolutely 100% agree with you on that. And you know, very often when we're working with clients, they want to do the kind of the measurement at the end, and it's like, you know, how useful was this day, or did you like the, you know, the course? And so, well, so what if they thought it was useful? What's the outcome we're after? Which leads me on to the fact that, you know, as psychologists, Justin's already alluded to this, you know, we're always interested in looking at the evidence base, but looking at practice as well. And as Justin said, we've been kind of doing a lot of experimenting over the last year, but before then as well, and looking at, well, how can we take the best of all these different disciplines and kind of use it for good? So Justin's already mentioned the book, written with our other wonderful colleague, Belinda Ganaway, who is the design thinking expert. And we started thinking, well, how can we use, you know, design thinking? How can we use positive psychology? How can we use neuroscience? And but really takes a much more multidisciplinary approach to deliberately designing learning. But I think, as you said, Justin, one of the key differences really is that, you know, starting to approach this as you would developing a product. So thinking about the end user. So rather than taking an off-the-shelf course and just kind of banging it out, and those don't really work that well, do they? Thinking about, well, let's think about the person we're designing for here. So that was a real kind of revelation to us, along with this idea that actually any kind of learning intervention, if you like, shouldn't be a one-off. It shouldn't be an isolated thing. It has to be part of an overall approach, which brings me on to some of the key principles we've been kind of playing around with. And a lot of this stuff is not new, and you'll recognize this, but what we're trying to do is to bring it all together in one place to make it easy. I'm going to flash up some slides, and then we'll come back to seeing people again. But one of the first principles that we talked about was this idea of a fertile soil. Yeah, this is obvious. You'll know this. I'm preached to the converted, but you know, the soil's got to be right to allow people to grow, develop, and learn. And I mean, how often do we work with companies? And I myself, I did 10 years in-house working for big corporates where, you know, we haven't got time. It's a classic barrier to anyone being able to learn, because it almost feels like, you know, learning is a luxury. If you've got time to learn, you're not busy enough, you know. And sitting down with a book at work, can you imagine if you sat at your desk with a book at work with your highlighter pen, or watched a YouTube clip, whatever, you know. It's in many organizations, the culture isn't fertile enough, the soil isn't fertile enough to enable learning to take place. It's seen as a nice to have, not a must have, and that needs to change. Absolutely. I know I'm preaching the converted here, but that was kind of a, you know, a key revelation, if you like. Having a clear vision, again, you know, again, this is really obvious stuff, but a lot of companies we work with don't have this. They're not really sure why they are, you know, taking the approach they're taking. They're not really sure what they want it to achieve, other than they've got it on their spreadsheet of tasks. They want to tick the box. Yes, we've rolled out an innovation course. Brilliant. They've gone through innovation training. Great. Let's move on. Don't really go beyond that. So the clear vision piece, feel free to jump in as well, Justin, if I'm missing anything out. The clear vision piece was also a critical kind of principle. And Justin's already alluded to this idea of embedded learning. You know, Dr. Bonnie-Chook, we're big fans of Bonnie-Chook, and she came on our Reset show, which is another learning experiment we've embarked upon. Some of you might have come along to that, which is just bringing together like-minded people with experts or practitioners to really talk about different areas of work, really. And Bonnie-Chook talks about embedding learning in the flow of work. And learning isn't something that happens in isolation. It happens, you know, pretty much every moment, every day. Going back to me as a psychologist here, you know, we don't stop learning when we step outside the classroom. We're always learning. And when you start to think of this in a different way and thinking about, you know, the learning experience, suddenly this is where we thought, actually, there are some brilliant tools from design thinking that could really help us to see learning not as an isolated one-off, or not even as part of a bigger campaign, but as a journey that the employee takes when they enter the organization, even before and after they've left. What does that journey look like? And where are the opportunities to help them to grow and develop? And just very quickly, People Lab released some research this year, which was basically analysis of thousands of what we call best experience stories. So we've been out over the 12 years we've been going and asked people to tell us about a time when they were absolutely their best at work. We've analysed all the results, and I won't go into all that now, but it won't come as any surprise to know that, you know, this idea of having the opportunity to grow at work. It's growth that was the important thing. It wasn't necessarily I got trained to be, whatever a Prince thingy method, methodology. I got trained to do whatever, a compliance certificate. It was about I could grow and develop. So people need this to have this great experience at work, and they need challenge as well. We like challenge. We get we get to know good when we're bored as human beings. So we need challenge, we need growth. So how do you embed learning in the flow of work? Justin, I'm sure you've got some comments you can add to that, because this is something you're really passionate about, isn't it? This idea of embedding it in the flow of work. You're on mute again. Still can't hear you. Struggling to unmute. There we go.
Thank you. I was being prevented by the host from unmuting.
Katie, was it me?
The very cheek of it, what a liberty. That is one way to keep me quiet. Yeah, Emma, I really, so to build a little bit on what you said, because also I'm keen to hear people's thoughts, but what I like about these three principles is that they combine the old and the new. So as you said, a lot of what we're talking about in these three principles is research that's been around for a long time, but somehow it hasn't been knitted together and put in the same package. And the big thing for me that strikes me about these three principles is it is the responsibility of leadership, isn't it, to ensure all of these three things happen. I mean, it's only leaders can ensure the fertile soil. It's the key thing with the fertile soil is this notion of psychological safety. So it's not just about leaders saying, yes, you can have a training budget, which is this one challenge, but it's about the culture that is endemic in the organization, where we have an expectation that people will learn and that people will get things wrong, of course, as well. And that's how we learn and grow. And it's those organizations that manage to create that atmosphere of psychological safety that see people taking that initiative themselves and taking those risks and making those links because they're safe. They know their job isn't on the line, or their box marking at the end of the year, or their bonus, or whatever it is that stops people and keeps them kind of like, well, I'll just keep doing what I've always done. And then this other principle, or the final one about embedded, I mean, this builds on decades of research about how we like to learn. We are all unique individuals, and we all have these different preferences for how we like to absorb information. We know all of this already, and yet we sort of have a model that just does, well, yeah, 8 hours in a training room. So the Bonnie Chuck's theory about embedding work in the flow of embedding learning in the flow of work speaks to that as well. So there's this idea that you can have bite-sized bits of information that you absorb however you want. So if you like to read, you read. If you like to watch, you watch. If you like to listen, you listen. But the key thing is that you get a chance to try it out, see what works, and get the feedback and keep on growing, which of course links back to fertile soil. You're not going to get that if there isn't fertile soil. And if you don't have the clear vision, you don't know what the point of any of it is anyway. So all of those three things are key. And that brings us to what we wanted to talk about. We mentioned tech a little bit. So this was one of the areas that the pandemic forced everyone in learning and development to really dig into and explore. So you tended, I think most of us would agree in the past, you tended to fall into one of two camps. It was either it's sort of e-learning or live in-person intervention. And we didn't have live intervention. So suddenly you thought, well, what are we going to do? And it's a little bit tempting always to get excited about all the tech. And first of all, as people have been saying, not everyone has access to tech. If you're a scaffolder on the side of a tower in an outage on a power station, you don't have any tech. You've got your mobile phone in a rubber case at best. So it's important that we don't concentrate all of the conversation on white collar workers who've got, Zoom and ring lights and all of that access to all of that tech as well. But what we discovered as we explored tech was, I think a lot of us will have found this, is that maybe from having been a little Luddite about it before, a little nervous about it and saying, oh, there's nothing like being in the room, we've discovered that, yes, there is nothing like being in the room, But there is something else that also has value, and that is the ability to interact with people in short bursts of time all across the globe, which would be impossible otherwise. And by using tech, you can really build a platform for people to design their own learning experience. So you can offer resources that people can digest, as I said earlier, in various different formats. But the whole principle of using tech has to be about connection. It has to be about finding ways for us to enhance our connection when we can't be physically connected with people. And I think we've all managed over the year to figure out which bits help and which bits don't help. So there's been a kind of backlash recently into Zoom fatigue, and, you know, whatever happened to good old fashioned phone calls? You know, why does everyone have to Zoom? You know, it's like, I never used to Zoom you, I used to just phone you. And you know, how the brain processes phone calls different to Zoom calls, and different to reading material as well. So there was a lot to grapple with in terms of tech, but we found that a certain judicious use of tech is really helpful. And then there's a point where it just kind of gets in the way, which is probably the way we've always been with tech in the workplace anyway. You know, with PowerPoint, we kind of gorged ourselves on endless slides with graphs and figures no one can read. And then someone kind of went, hang on, this is just really not working. And it's kind of the same, I think, with our tech experience virtually. Do you want to pick up on that?
Well, on the tech piece?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I think for me, before COVID, online was the poor relation. It was like, oh, we can't all get in a room together, so we'll do something online. So we've always done stuff online, right? For years. And what I think the last years has really kind of enabled us to do is to really raise our game and get good at it, and learn so much, and learn what works and what doesn't work. And it's like just learning in the moment, learning in the flow of work, literally by the seat of our pants a lot of the time. So it's been a great learning experience in terms of what does work and what doesn't work. Just coming on to that, I wanted just to move the conversation on, just to talk about this designing a learning experience. And as I said, you know, using some of the tools and ideas that Belinda and I talk about in the book. Just wanted to share some of those with you. And I think, you know, the difference here is that previously, I mean, I actually started my career at the age of, well, I was like 23, 24 as an academic, right? So I've always worked in the world of learning. I got my first lecturing gig because I was doing a part-time master's, and someone didn't want to do the evening session. They said, can you do it, the 6 till 9? I was like, yeah, I'll do it. But I think previously what we designed, you know, sessions, learning sessions, and just the word experience just really elevates this to get you thinking about, well, how is it for the people that we are, you know, working with? What is the experience like for them? It's just a subtle shift, but it really makes you think differently. And we've been playing around with this idea of using the tools that we use for designing any employee experience, whether it's, you know, an onboarding experience, whether it's an internal communication experience, whether it's a cultural experience. It's actually, we can use these tools to design a learning experience. That's really exciting. And there's a model in the book that Belinda and I have developed called the 3 lenses model. And it's a really useful starting point to think about, well, going back to that clear vision piece, you know, this learning experience, this learning that we think we might need our people to go through. Clearly, it's got to be right for the organisation, right? We've got a job to do. It's got to be right. It's got to align to what we're all about as an organisation, or maybe not. Some organisations are happy for people to learn in other ways, but it ultimately is somewhere it contributes to what we're all about. It's got to be right for the work. It's got to be right operationally with the work we do. If I'm in a call centre and I'm tasked with getting through a certain amount of calls every day, how do we create opportunities to learn? The important bit, I think, the interesting bit though, is it's got to be right for our people, their needs, their expectations, and their motivations. And this is much more than learning styles. I'll explain in a minute. So that's a good place to start. Some of you might recognise this. Belinda will do a much better job of explaining it than I will, because she's our design thinking expert. But this is the double diamonds, the middle diamond and the far right diamond are kind of the design council's sort of design thinking approach, if you like. And in the book, we've added a third diamond in the scoping space. And what we do is we kind of use it as a framework. You can see how you could apply this to a learning experience by saying, well, what's our ideal? So let's start by scoping this. If we were to take people through this learning experience, what would the ideal be? What would it look like? And the positive psychology comes in there, that kind of future vision. What's the best it could be? What does good look like? What is the ideal and how do we measure up? And where do we need to focus and why? And then moving into the opportunity space, empathize. I think bringing some empathy to designing learning is absolutely a game changer. I hold my hands up here. For many years, I never really, I think about maybe we'll use some video and some case studies and some group work to appeal to different learning styles. But it's more about, ticking the box. And it was a little bit of thinking about their experience, but not really empathizing fully with the people who are going through any sort of learning experience. So we use tools around empathy and helping to define the human need. And then, let's ideate. I know it's a bit of a cringe word, but let's think about all the different ways that we can make this happen rather than just go for the obvious. Let's think about, what are all the different ways we can help people to take this learning journey? And then let's prototype it. Let's test and learn. Let's get out there and try some stuff out and experiment, see what works. So you can see really clearly how this framework, you can kind of lift it into any employee experience. And the one we're talking about today is designing a learning experience. We can send you more information on this, and I say it is in the book. Journey mapping, again, another tool from design thinking that lends itself really brilliantly to the learning journey. Something that Justin and I actually have used with client projects over the last year to think about that end-to-end learning journey. Now, this is a journey map that's actually specifically for kind of an employee coming in and go around their life cycle, but you can see how you could change the words there and look at the different, you can look at the different learning opportunities at those different points across the employee life cycle. You could do it that way, or you could take a specific learning journey and change the words at the top and map that, and just really gets you thinking about, well, how is it for them? What might they be thinking, feeling, doing? What are the goals? What's the current experience like? What could the experience like? What should it be like? So again, another really cool tool that you can use to help you think about this, designing a whole learning experience. The other thing I wanted to talk about was learning personas. So personas are a tool that we use. They're a thinking tool in employee experience to help us really put ourselves in the shoes of the people we're designing for. Now, sometimes I get a bit of pushback on personas. People say, oh, it's just stereotyping, but it's absolutely not. This is not about putting people in boxes. It's about really thinking around, well, what data, what insights have we got that are going to help me understand where those people, where that group of people are coming from? And I think learning personas, a really underrated tool that we can use to really help us design learning experiences going to work for our people. And like I say, you can use them in so many different ways. They're basically a way of kind of just very quickly getting your headspace into how it feels for the people that are going through that experience. So this is about empathy being a superpower. And we've had some real success with this, with clients over the last sort of few years, taking this approach. But learning personas are only as good as if they're only useful if we actually use them. And an empathy map, again, another tool from the world of design thinking that we can use to really take our learning personas and then consider specific learning experiences and say, well, so if we think about the one before, the no waffle will, what are they hearing? What are they seeing? What do they want to say and do if we're designing learning experiences for them? And it really helps us to get in the shoes of the people we're designing for. So it might sound a little bit full on and overwhelmed when you first look at this, but these are all tools really just to help you think differently. And they just remind you to take a slightly different approach. So they're just really helpful to take you on that journey, if you like. Really big fan of the work of Niels Floor. So if you Google him, have a look at his stuff, he talks in depth about using design thinking tools for learning and designing learning experiences. And I'm sure many of you have used a business model canvas at some point in your career. If you haven't, don't worry about it. But he's developed this brilliant tool called the Learning Experience Canvas, and you can download this direct from his website. And again, it just takes you through in a very deliberate and intentional way some of the areas you might want to think about when you're designing a learning experience. So just another tool that you can use. I just want to kind of fly through those pretty quickly, just to say there are some great tools that will help you hold your hand really through thinking differently about designing learning experiences. Okay, I'm going to go back over to you, Justin. I'm going to talk about, actually, I'll leave the slides up, shall I? Is that helpful?
Yeah, you might want to, in a moment, you might want to click through. Yeah, but I'll give you a shout. Yeah, there we go. So, yeah, so folks, we're in the final furlongs of what we want to share with you today. So shortly we'll be opening the floor for questions, provocations, disagreements, jokes, whatever you feel like sharing. But just to bring this to life, oh, and while I think about it as well, you know, what I love about all of the tools you've shared, is that, you know, some people will want to go through them in detail, won't they? And fill in every box and really consider all of the, and then other people will, like me, will be like, oh, that's really interesting. Okay. And then, you know, how does that help me? But that's what I like about them, is you can dip in and out of them to the depth that is appropriate for your own persona. Obviously, like No Waffle Will is just gonna give me the headlines. How can I use this? Slight digression. So this is just to give you an idea of what one of the programs we ran looks like logistically, really, I suppose. So this was a program we ran for a financial services organization. And obviously for confidentiality, we've taken out any references to who they actually are. But this was a really interesting process. So to Emma's point about when you can, so as a training provider, when we can have that conversation with the learning and development, the HR team in this case, about what are we going to do, because we have this commission to deliver this training, we can't deliver it in person, so how can we reinvent it so that it's even better than it would have been in person? And we started by imagining that if this is your 8-hour, 1-day delivery model and it's crashes to the side, well, now you've got blocks that you can just pull apart. So suddenly you have these bite-sized bits of learning opportunities that you can group however you want. So in this context, we grouped them in, I think it was 3 or 4, depending on which program this was. So we spread them out. So that was the starting point. We're like, okay, so we have these short interventions, which we'll run virtually, because again, we know that 2 hours is about the maximum any one human being can sustain any level of concentration on Zoom or on a virtual platform when they're learning. So nice short interventions, but let's spread them out across the weeks. So that actually what we do is we have this lovely little cycle where people can have some training, then spend time putting it into practice, and then regroup and review, and then plan for the next, and then regroup. So you build it out across this lovely arc here that you've got. So you've got session 1, 2, and 3. But before we do that, we use a little bit of tech that we like as a platform. Some of you will be familiar, which is a platform called Video Ask, which has replaced the standard SurveyMonkey pre-course questionnaire for us. So what that does is it does a number of different things. So it's essentially, for those of you that don't know, participants click a link and there is the face of the program leader, giving them a little bit of background to the program and the aims, and you know, where maybe the context where it came from, what the business goals are, but very quickly shifts to asking them some questions about their own experience. So straight away starting to build data for us in terms of who are these people we're working with, what's their experience, what are their strengths, what are their hopes, what might be their blind spots. So we also ran a series of video asks to those people's managers and asked them the same questions. So then we have more data, because you can go, okay, so this is people's assessment of themselves. This is what the managers are seeing. Is there a gap? And if there is a gap, what can we do to address that gap? So you build all of this information before you even meet people. And of course, that then influences the choice of the material you share in each session and the positioning of that across the whole journey. And then when it's finished at the end, of course, you get this video ask survey, which provides feedback on what we set out to achieve. So again, this goes to participants and also to key stakeholders, so people who are going to be on the receiving end. And in between all of these sessions, you get all of these resources. So you get pre-course work, which means the first, normally the first part of any training session is establishing context and explaining key principles. That's all done. So you meet people, they're ready to work, they already have a common understanding. And then in between the session, that's where the fun really happens. You can create a series of resources. We opted to share a couple of must-do resources. So there's a TED Talk to watch, for example, or a conversation to have with a peer, for example. But then you have these other additional resources. So if someone's particularly interested in something that's come up in the session, they get a chance in their own time to dive into that stuff. But if they're not particularly interested in that, they don't have to sit in a training room and listen to the trainer talk about it for an hour. So it really adds this sense of engagement that people have. They start to be able to pick and mix and choose the bits that are particularly relevant for them and that they want a little bit more detail about. And then in this context, we set them a task which they had to complete between session 2 and 3. So it was a task specifically related to the training. So that gives you a sense. It's spread out over weeks, and with the same client, we've run different programs, and the current one we're running is now a 6-session program. So we've expanded the content and added extra programs. So that runs for we spend 3 months with participants. And for me as a trainer, what I love is that I now have the relationship that with participants on these kind of programs that I have with coachees who you see over a series of weeks or months or sessions, which you don't really ever get to have with participants in a one-drop session before. So it really deepens and enriches the relationship and your ability to flex depending on the need that comes up and emerges over the course of the process. So that's an idea of what it might look like. And what's lovely is that it can scale back, or it's like a concertina. You can stretch it out or group it together, depending on the particular need, and of course the diaries and availability for people. And finally, one thing just to say, this has just made it so much easier to work with people across all different parts of the world, because as long as you can find a time slot where everyone can dial in, then you have these great, rich cross-cultural conversations with people within the same business. Em, anything else you want to add about that, or do you want to dive into the next one?
Yeah, I mean, just really endorsing everything that you've talked about, and all these amazing lessons that we're learning. So I've just put up the next just a few kind of tips here. Really, if you haven't used Video Ask, it's amazing. It really humanizes the experience. Well, not on its own, it doesn't, but it helps to humanize the experience, because suddenly you get a link in your inbox, and it's just saying, hey, I'm going to be meeting you next week, I'm really looking forward to it, and you see the person. It's just that human connection, and you get some really great feedback. It's a really, really cool tool, and we use it all the time now. So I definitely recommend Video Ask. Got a few other ideas down here as well. Again, probably things that you're all doing. So, collaboration tools, warm-ups. One of the clients we work with did this really cool thing called Adventures in Text, where they got sort of set like little mini missions, if you like, in between sort of formal check-ins. And it was kind of, if you choose to accept, your mission is, and it was, really interesting, a different way of getting people to try things and to give them that psychological safety, saying you can test some of this out, it's okay. Obviously things like podcasts, well, I actually don't like a podcast. I'm one of the only people that's not a podcast fan. I like to read a book and get my highlighter out. I'd rather listen to music, but the idea is using lots of different tactics and tools as part of the overall approach. And learning pod is something that Justin and I are fans of. Really, they're kind of action learning sets, really, aren't they, Justin? But we're giving them a funkier title, would you say?
I would, but also the added benefit they have is that you start to, particularly when you can bring participants from different areas of the business, they start to spill out and have a function beyond just embedding the learning, because of course what you're doing is you're kind of creating those water cooler in the training room moments, but you're building those in again to the flow of their work. So they're automatically having these meetings and having these conversations about maybe the training, but that spills out into creating these networks across the organization as well, which is another kind of happy byproduct, if you like, of the learning pods.
Absolutely. Just before I'm going to finish up on this, but just before I finish up on this, it might be worth checking out the recent research show with the Ministry of Justice came onto the research show, Karen and Ruth, and they are using a lot of these tools to design their learning experiences. They're kind of looking at the data, what do their people want. One of their big findings was they work with a big like employee engagement network, and they found that, you know, the way that they like to learn is from each other. That's their preferred way of learning, and they've kind of really taken this whole idea of designing a learning experience and you know, and really kind of, you know, really embraced it fully, and they're using a lot of the tools that we're talking about here. So that's a great case study of how an organization, and one that's actually quite traditional really, the MOJ, have taken these ideas and kind of really made it work. So just before we go over to you for questions, I can stop sharing now because you don't need to read that anymore. I just wanted to finish up on this idea of culture and mindset, which again, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but I think that sometimes it's easy to kind of just gloss over the importance of this. We've talked about the fertile soil. So we've kind of covered the culture bit. We've talked about how we need to value learning and to make time for it and to resource it and create psychological safety. We've kind of covered that. The bit I'm really interested in, though, is that Justin, you mentioned Ken Robinson before. If anyone hasn't seen Ken's TED Talks, please have a look at them. They are amazing. And Ken, God bless him, rest in peace, Ken. He did pass away, didn't he, recently? I think a few years ago. He's an amazing guy. But anyway, he talks about this idea that we are absolutely hardwired to be curious and want to learn. It's why we've evolved to be who we are today, right? It's in us. And at every step of the way, all of our systems kind of try to sort of squeeze it out of us. So the way we educate people, and I'm really passionate about this, I say if I won the lottery tomorrow, I'd set up free schools, do things differently. But the way we educate people, it's a really narrow system that suits a few people. And if you're slightly outside of that, forget it, because we're not going to help you learn in that way. And it's the same at work, right? You know, we have a very narrow way of approaching how we help people grow and develop and learn. And I'm really passionate that, you know, we need to find ways to really unlock people's potential. And I said the culture piece is absolutely key. And I'm really clear that we also have a personal responsibility for, you know, it's not just down to the organization, come on, help me learn. We also have to step up and say, you know, I want to learn, I want to grow. But in my experience, pretty much everybody is in that place, but they just have been so badly let down over so many years, they kind of give up and think, well, what's the point? And we need to kind of reawaken that in people. So I'm actually about to embark on some new research looking at the role of mindset and what helps people to re-engage with their learning, what helps people to kind of find that enthusiasm and love for wanting to grow and develop in a way that works for them. Because if it's not for everybody, they want to kind of tick a box and go, I've got a certificate or I've got a master's. A lot of people want to grow in different ways, but how do we release that potential? So on that note, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to hand it over to you guys for questions. I'm sure you've got some comments on what I've just said there, where people are thinking of questions, haven't you, Justin?
We have got one question already in the chat.
Okay.
If I pose the first question and then hopefully other people add some additional questions to the chat. If you want me to unmute you as well, if you'd rather ask the question verbally, just pop it in the chat and I will unmute you. So first question then we've got from Martin Spence. So Martin would like to hear any tips for influencing customers to take this approach to developing learning this way, as it's quite traditional, quite different to the traditional approach.
Well, this one, Martin, comes up very often, very regularly on the Reset Show. So if you haven't already watched the Reset shows, there's a couple in particular where I think it's probably, Emma, if you can help me out thinking about who it might be. I think it was probably Carly Lauf's one. There's probably a few. And in essence, the advice is always the same, which is, you know, it's the classic influencing of putting yourself in that person's shoes. You know, what is important to them? And once you've established that, what is the story that you can tell? in order to persuade them. And the great thing about it all is this prototyping is, you know, to take small risks. I think it was Rob Baker talked about this as well, didn't he, on the talk about mitigated risks. So just taking one team in one department for one intervention, trying that out. So yeah, so I would say, you know, the data is there to support the argument if you need it to be a data-driven argument. But as well, we know not everyone is driven by data, and ultimately data is only a means to activate our emotions. So that's what's really going to drive change. Emma, what do you want to add to that?
I completely agree with all of that. I'm also a big fan of a bit of neuroscience as well, because it's really hard to argue with what's going on in your brain. So I quite often pull out some neuroscience. I'm a massive fan of Sean Aker, Happiness Advantage, around, you know, when we have great experiences at work, what happens in our brain is we release loads of dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter that's associated with feeling good. And guess what dopamine does? It switches on all the learning centers in our brain. So when you've got people who've got their learning centers activated, guess what? They're going to do a much better job for you. So there's a load of evidence that sits there. So for those people who kind of need to be convinced it isn't just kind of the latest fad or a little bit kind of fluffy, I do find the neuroscience tends to land really well. It's quite hard to argue with this stuff. It's like, well, why wouldn't you? And as you said, Justin, the other thing is to tap into people's own experiences. So find out, you know, I mean, we always talk about best experience stories. Asking people to sort of say, well, you know, love to find out about a time when you were at your best at work, when you're thriving. Tell me about that. And everyone's got a story. In years of doing this, I only had one person that said, I've never felt that at work, but everyone else, thousands of people have. And inevitably, I guarantee they will talk about, there'll be some element of growth, development, challenge, learning in there, which you can use or play back to them because it's their experience. And also it's emotional to them as well. So that can work wonders to kind of get things through.
Yeah, there's another question about evaluation and return on expectation investment from training interventions. And this is, in some ways, that question hasn't changed. But one of the things that's interesting in the research that we cited earlier is the importance of the longevity of the training intervention. The longer the intervention, the higher the efficacy or the measurable efficacy of it is. So it is about reinventing measurements. You know, one end of the scale, you've got, as Emma said, you've got the happy sheet at the end of the day, which just tells you whether people have had a nice afternoon. That's kind of it, really. It doesn't tell you anything else. To Martin's point earlier about the lack of correlation between training you enjoy and training you put into practice. So I think what it is building in a series of milestones. So what we're doing is we're evaluating after the training, but about a month afterwards, to start to measure what are the bits that people have kept hold of, but also we're looping back to what I said about consulting with key stakeholders before. We're saying to them, you know, well, what would you expect to see tangibly as a result of this intervention? And then checking in with them and going, well, are you seeing that? And if so, great. And if not, well, then something's gone wrong. Thankfully, so far, we haven't had that situation where it hasn't worked. But Em, I know you're hotter on measures than I am in this area.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Justin, the methodology hasn't changed. So I was talking about process impact and outcome measures. The process measures are like, was it useful? I'd rather not ask process measures, but companies love it. So it's like, okay, you know, let's pick your battles, win the war. Your impact measures are your initial. So how is this landing? Is it having an initial impact on people, either thinking differently, feeling differently, or behaving differently? And the outcome measures really are about what is the purpose of this? What is the outcome? I.e., is it that we want people to be nicer to customers, or sell more, or stop leaving us, or what is it? So there's your outcome measures. So that's how I would look at that. In terms of so early signals, so Justin and I were involved in a joint piece of work last year, and we were both, I can't say the client unfortunately, because they're one of those clients that get really funny about you talking about them. It's the best piece of feedback that I've ever had from training. We actually couldn't quite believe it, could you, Justin? He's like, which one are you thinking about? You know what I'm thinking about? Because we thought we kind of went through the process. So, you know, and given a blank sheet of paper, it may not have been what we would have designed, but it was right for the people, it was right for the audience, right? And they loved it, and it really, really hit home with them. I mean, in terms of, you know, previous, you know, from like however many years ago, you know, I've been kind of dabbling with this for a number of years, and I've always found when I do coaching training, it only ever really works when I can convince the client to put in place learning pods or action learning sets so they can carry on having regular supervisory conversations and get together. Where I've been able to do that, I've had amazing feedback, you know, even a year down the line, and get together, you know, with quite often I'll sort of say to have sort of, you know, one-day events every quarter where they get together, we bring in speakers and what have you. And where I've been able to convince clients to go for that, the difference in feedback has been like this. You know, initially, I mean, coaching training, great. I do a line managers as coaches kind of 2-day. Initially, brilliant, off the scale, because people love, I mean, I think coaching trains itself really, because as you experience being coached, you go, wow, it's really powerful. So you always get good feedback. But then it kind of tails off because they go, oh, it's just too busy, you know, hadn't got time for it. It doesn't become an embedded habit. Whereas where you were able to put the overall experience in place. So I've had that, you know, previous to kind of really coming up with this approach, I've had that experience as well. What else we got going on here, question wise?
Well, this is one for you, Em, I think, because it was you mentioning people's full potential. And I know this is a hot favorite topic for you. Remember, we've only got a few minutes left. From your experience, what is the most effective way to unleash people's full potential?
That's such a massive question, isn't it? I think going back to the best experience conversation is that, well, first of all, don't try to guess. Don't decide, don't come up with it in an ivory tower, because we're all so unique and different. And when we share the results of this research that we did with you, the Magica model as it's called, there are two sides to the coin. When you ask people to tell you about a time when they're at their best, or tell me about a time when you felt you were really reaching your full potential, you can use it in any way. Subject matter can be anything, but you get people to tell you about a time when you're at your full potential, or whatever words you want to use. They'll tell you, and you'll get so much insight from that. And you'll be able to say, well, how near or far away from that? And what's interesting is when you have these kinds of conversations, there are always what I call universal themes that come. You'll find, you know, kind of like any kind of psychological text you find in any organization around the world, but there'll always be individual differences. So one person might say, well, I was at my full potential because I had freedom and I could do whatever I wanted and I felt so liberated. Someone else might say, I was at my full potential because there was a really clear brief and I knew exactly what was expected of me, and I had that structure. You ask people the question, they'll tell you the answer, and then you can work on that. Say, okay, well, that tells us where we need to get to. How near or far? What do we need to do to get you there? So it's really, really powerful conversation to have. I'll get Katie to include in the follow-up the guide to having a best experience conversation. It's dead simple, but just in case you're thinking, how do I do that again? There's instructions for you.
Yeah, I'll also include the research.
Sorry, say again, Katie?
I'll include the research about best experiences as well, because it's great reading. Yes,
and I just have to jump in and say, Karen, you took the words right out of my mouth. It is, so Karen's recommended Alive at Work by Dan Cable. I'm sure there'll be other recommended reading, but what a fascinating study as part of that book. It's exactly to this point of realizing full potential. And talk about an employee experience, you know, it actually starts on day one when they turn up. The first intervention they have is effectively as the leader asking them to reflect on that question and share it with their new colleagues. And talk about, we mentioned earlier about data. I mean, the data points on that are extraordinary, the research. And again, mapped over time, isn't it, Karen? Like it's, you know, 1 month, 6 months, on every measure. And it's extraordinary. But this is, again, back to what we were saying earlier about, you know, fertile soil. So the leaders in that business get this stuff and have a clear vision. So they articulate that vision to people as well. And yeah, you know, and it's embedded. It's just one little chunk as part of what they do. Absolutely fantastic recommendation. Yeah, I love that one.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else got any other recommendations, let us know. We'll put it in a little book list for you. We'll put a few other recommendations together for you as well. But yeah, brilliant book. Love that. Okay, we've got about 4 minutes, so we're almost at time. Are there any other questions coming through? We've got time for one last quick question. If not, then you are free to enjoy your Thursday evening. I've got tomorrow off work, so I'm I'm going shopping. Don't judge me. I'm looking forward to touching and feeling personal preference. My daughter's like, "Why you don't just do it all online?" I'm like, "I want to touch and feel the clothes." So thank you all though for joining us. Really appreciate it. And we are kind of at the beginning of this journey, really. There's lots of stuff we've been doing for a long time, but just we're at the beginning of kind of consolidating it into an approach. So I would love to continue the conversation and get your thoughts and hear what's working for you. And we're always up for a bit of challenge and a bit of debate. We love that. So yeah, join us on this journey, because it's going to be, I think it's going to be really exciting. And yeah, we are looking forward to seeing what the future holds. So thank you all, everyone. I think with that, I shall just say, feel free to enjoy your Thursday evening. Justin, any final words from you?
No, I think you've said it all. Thanks, Emma.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, come along to the next webinar or join us at the Reset Show, which is brilliant. I'm going to say that, obviously, but you don't have to be there live. You can listen to it on podcast or see it on YouTube. And there's just such brilliant speakers on it. So yeah, make sure you check out the Reset Show. And
yes, I've learned a lot over the last year from our guests. So
definitely.
Thank you,
Have a good
folks.
evening. Take care. See you soon.
Cheers.
So, bye.